Hello. Good evening. My name is Todd Stocky. I am Senior Vice President and Editorial Director at Sourcebooks. Thank you for joining us for the second installment of Murder at the Library Book Club, brought to you by us at Sourcebooks, Poison Pen Press, and our friends at Baker and Taylor. I'm thrilled to be here with Les Klinger, award-winning author and the editor of the Library of Congress Crime Classic series published by Poison Pen Press in partnership with the Library of Congress, and with Bill Ott, the former Booklist publisher and editor. Before we begin our discussion, I have a couple of housekeeping items for you to be aware of. You will have multiple chances to win prizes throughout the event this evening. All you have to do is participate in one of our trivia polls or ask a question of Les and/or Bill, and you'll be entered in to win a Library of Congress Crime Classics prize pack. And some other fun mystery-themed goodies from Sourcebooks. And don't worry, we will call out when there's something to participate in, so you'll know when that is happening. Also, if you have questions for Les or Bill through the evening, please put them into the Q&A section as opposed to the chat section. So you'll see that, or should see that along the bottom, a Q&A section. So please use that rather than chat. They might get lost in the chat, and we have folks who are administrating the Q&A. So let's begin with a little background on Les, who is considered to be one of the world's foremost authorities on Sherlock Holmes, Dracula, H.P. Lovecraft, Frankenstein, and the history of mystery and horror fiction. He served 3 terms as the chapter president of the SoCal chapter of Mystery Writers of America as well. And if that's not impressive enough, Les has received numerous awards and nominations, including the Edgar for Best Critical Biographical not once but twice. His introductions and essays have appeared in numerous books, journals, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, and he was the technical advisor for Warner Brothers on the film Sherlock Holmes, A Game of Shadows. And as I mentioned earlier, Bill Ott was the editor and publisher of Booklist, a role he filled for over 30 years. And since his retirement, he's continued as a contributing editor there. Throughout his career with Booklist, Bill edited and reviewed crime fiction, and his mystery showcase issues have long been a highlight for mystery-loving librarians. Bill is also a librarian. Once a librarian, also a librarian, always a librarian. And before coming to Booklist, he worked in acquisitions and materials selection at multiple library systems in the Seattle area. So hello, Les and Bill. It's great to have you both here this evening. So let's dive in. Folks are done hearing from me. They want to hear from you. So Les, maybe let's start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be an expert and I guess a real aficionado,
Everything.
super passionate about classic mysteries and horror?
Well, I got to be an expert the same way everybody does. You write a book. I mean, you don't have to really know anything. You just have to publish a book with your name on it, and then you're branded as an expert. I started out as a librarian. I went to Berkeley undergrad, and I worked in the stacks there as a stack assistant for the years of my undergraduate experience, and actually during my first year of law school, and loved it. Have always loved books. I've always loved reading. I didn't really pay much attention, however, to the mystery genre until I was in law school, and I got hooked by the William S. Baring-Gould massive 2-volume annotated Sherlock Holmes. And I discovered not only footnotes, a passion that has continued for many, many years, but the whole cult of Sherlock Holmes and really the larger mystery world. And I began to read in mysteries and endeavored to learn a lot more about the field of mysteries. Before that, I was just a science fiction reader.
So we're here tonight to talk about a little bit about the Library of Congress Crime Classics series, and the rat that began to gnaw the rope is part of that. Can you, Les, give us some background on the series for everyone?
Sure.
How did the series come together? How did you come to be a part of it?
Well, clearly the mother of this series is Barbara Peters of Poison Pen Press. Barbara had been publishing and continues to publish the British Library's Crime Classics series, which is a wonderful series of Golden Age mysteries. And she had this idea, well, why can't we do this for American crime fiction too? Barbara has some historic connections with the Library of Congress. She actually worked there at some early point in her career. And her husband, Rob Rosenwald, who was the publisher of Poison Pen Press, um, his grandfather donated the Julius Rosenwald collection to the library. So they had a deep affection for the library and connections there. The three of us went to Washington 2 years ago and sat down with the staff of the library, which, to my surprise, has a very active publishing arm. And we talked to them about this idea. They loved it. The rest is history. How I got involved is that Barbara and Rob and I have been friends for a long time because, and that friendship came about from my writing and publishing and doing appearances at the Poison Pen bookstore. But they knew that in particular, I had an interest in the history of mystery fiction because one of the books I did for them, I've done two books before this that related to that. One was called In the Shadow of Sherlock Holmes, and the other was called In the Shadow of Agatha Christie. And these were efforts by me to bring back into the light writers who had gotten lost in the shadow of these more famous authors or characters. So Victorian detective fiction was In the Shadow of Sherlock Holmes, specifically female crime writers of the 19th century and very early 20th century was the subject of In the Shadow of Agatha Christie. And they knew I loved those books and those stories. I had also written, and as you kindly mentioned, just won the Edgar for classic American crime fiction of the 1920s, which is similar. It's sort of books that I thought needed to be brought back into the spotlight. Dashiell Hammett was doing just fine without me, but that included Red Harvest, the first Charlie Chan, the first Ellery Queen, the first Philo Vance, and the great novel Little Caesar by W.R. Burnett. And so again, I was deeply enmeshed in studying the history of crime fiction and specifically American crime fiction. And so they asked me if I would do this, and I said, wow, yes.
Well, there's fascinating initial results here. There have been 3 books out this year. That Affair Next Door and Case Pending just came out a couple of weeks ago. And one of the books we're here to talk about tonight, The Rat Began to Gnaw the Rope. Can you tell us a little bit about this project?
So what we're trying to do with this series is to, again, bring back into the consciousness of readers books that may have gotten lost. These aren't, we're not discovering books that have never seen print before or anything like that. These are books that simply had their day before and then sort of people have forgotten about them. And we're going back all the way to 1866, eventually in the series, when the first American crime novel appeared, when we do The Dead Letter, and trying to go up through the 1960s. So almost a century of American crime writing. Case Pending is from 1961, I think. That Affair Next Door is from 1897. The Rat Began to Gnaw the Rope is from the 1940s. So this was written at a time when it was the eve of the war. America wasn't yet in the war. And at least that's the events of the book. It was actually written after the war started. And it's in some ways a sort of typical private eye novel, except that it's not about a private eye. It's about a lawyer who sort of stumbles into a mystery when a client walks in his office and he smells something fishy going on here. And to me, what was most interesting about it is that it's really the first great use of humor in this genre. It took some of the tropes of the hard-boiled private eye novel of the early 1940s and the 1930s and earlier, and leavened it with a good deal of humor. So we'll we'll talk a little more about it, but that was interesting to me. That was why this book made sense, and it was a well-received book at the time. It won an award and sold well and all those sorts of things. So
the protagonist was fascinating to me because and you make note of it in the introduction to the book that it was a very different style of protagonist than was typically featured in books of that time. He's kind of he's kind of a schlub.
yeah,
He's really, but he's sharp as a tack.
that's true. And he's very much like, in some ways, the Continental Op, the hero of Hammett's Red Harvest and a number of short stories, and the Dankers. In that, he's middle-aged. Now, Gil Henry isn't quite middle-aged. He's not old, but he's on the young side of middle age. Paunchy, not very tall, not especially good-looking. This is a long way from Sam Spade. Yet we can empathize with him. And this is drawn from the author's own life. I mean, the author was a municipal bond lawyer. We're saving up the name of the author for a little surprise in a bit. But the author was a municipal bond lawyer who basically wrote about practicing law in a small town. It's all set, as I recall, in a town in Kentucky, an unnamed town in Kentucky. And the author was writing, he lived in Lexington, I think. And so he wrote about his own life, and he knew what law offices were like, and accountants and secretaries and all the characters that populate this book.
There's an interesting moment tying into that early on where one of the characters says to Gil, "I don't know why, but I kind of like you." And then she goes on to say that he's very odd and doesn't know if she can trust him, but I don't know, I kind of like him. And I think a lot of people will have that same reaction. I think he's very interesting that way. And while House is right on the mark and saying it's part of the hard-boiled tradition, he's also right on the mark and saying this guy is no Philip Marlowe. You can't imagine anybody saying to particularly Humphrey Bogart that I don't know quite why I like you. And I think too that it's so interesting that he is, as you say, a schlub. He's also kind of a bumbler. I mean, he's very smart, but he makes a lot of mistakes all the way. And half
he
the
gets
time
shot at, beaten up, all kinds of terrible things.
He doesn't know what he's doing, and
No.
he fumbles around till he does.
He kind of knows it. He's self-deprecating.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
That's a good word. This is the first edition of the book, not our edition, but this one I'm covering up the name of the author, and here's what ours looks like. We should say a word about the beautiful cover on this too.
Yeah, tell us how these covers are coming together, Les.
So one of the things that we decided early on when Barbara and Rob and I were back at the Library of Congress, they said, we have some ideas for covers. And they said, let's show you the art department. And of course, the Library of Congress has a magnificent collection of art of 100 years, of all kinds. I mean, posters and magazine illustrations, photographs, all kinds of things. And all of these covers have been drawn from the Library of Congress's collection. And they're stunning images. We try and find sort of something appropriate. This is That Affair Next Door, and you can see a beautiful painting of a neighborhood in New York. And this is Case Pending, and the dolls, I will say, definitely have something to do with the story.
That is a truly creepy cover when you look at it.
It is. It is.
And it evokes the darkness in the novel too, though you wouldn't think pictures of dolls would do that. But after you had the book, you're kind of leaning toward Magician's Dummies when you look at those dolls. It's got that same kind of creepiness. That was a great choice.
So the three books are very different, and their differences are important to reflect sort of the breadth of where we're trying to go with the series. So That Affair Next Door, by the master Anna Catherine Green, was her first novel about the character that she named Amelia Butterworth. It's actually her second novel about the detective whose name is Ebenezer Gryce. Gryce appears in the Leavenworth case, which is Green's most famous novel. That came out in 1887. This is 10 years later. And it was she decided to use Gryce in a slightly different way. The principal protagonist of this book is Amelia Butterworth, who is a 50-ish spinster, lives in the Gilded Age of New York, and is part of that sort of upper crust. She finds there's a murder committed next door to her, and she decides that she can do it just as well as the police, the detecting thing, and gets deeply involved. And so that is very much in the tradition of sort of the older style, if you will, of the amateur detective. And in some ways it became a model. Certainly Agatha Christie made no bones about her love for Green's work, and knew Miss Butterworth well. So the amateur detective is represented by that book. The Rat Began to Gnaw the Rope is an example really of the private eye novel, a different kind in a way, but it's much more in the genre of the private eye. A client walks in, the person who ends up being the detective gets hired, they do the investigation. Case Pending is a very early version of what we now call a police procedural. Completely different. And by the way, we have another police procedural that's going to appear in the series. I think book 6, perhaps, called Last Seen Wearing by Hilary Waugh. Perhaps the greatest police procedural ever written. And what makes it a, quote, police procedural is that there is no hero. The detectives are, to some extent, ordinary people doing their jobs, working hard, having personal lives that somehow or sometimes get mixed up in the cases they're working. But a style of book that was new. I mean, we've forgotten that it was new because now we're so used to seeing these on television and the movies and all that. We have some great modern practitioners. Michael Connolly is certainly one of those, although he describes Harry Bosch as a private detective who happens to be working for the police force. And there's some truth to that, but that's very much in the tradition of the police procedural. Of course, Waugh was followed by Joe Wambaugh and many others who wrote about the police. Interestingly, Waugh says the inspiration for his book was Dragnet, something that many of us have sort of forgotten about. Dragnet began as a radio show in the 1940s and was extremely popular, and then went on to be equally popular as a television show, and ran on television for many, many years, and then went away and then came back, and they made some features out of it and so on. And just that idea, sort of just the facts, ma'am, not a flashy detective, just following the lives of ordinary police officers. So in any event, that's very much that's another part of the spectrum of the kind of crime fiction that we're presenting.
So in addition to obviously the books themselves, each of these books has a foreword from the Library of Congress, has an introduction by you, Les, and it also has, and this is interesting. I'm a book publisher, so I kind of geek out on these kinds of things. But there are book lovers and librarians on here with us, I'm sure, who would be interested in the notes. We have novels with footnotes. So tell me a little bit about how notes come together. How do you restrain yourself? How do you make that work in fiction?
So my view, which is I know not particularly original, I just saw it in print the other day from some scholar, is that great writing is a mirror of its time, and that time is in many cases not familiar to us. I mean, it's hard for me to say this, but the 1960s is now, Bill, classed as historical mystery fiction, you know?
Yeah,
Uh,
that's a sad fact, but a true one.
so, you know, certainly when we talk about books that came out in the 1860s or the early 20th century, or even the 1940s, there are things that are unfamiliar. So I've tried to confine my notes to mainly sort of being a guide. My wife would tell you that I'm one of those people who invariably talks to the screen during a movie or a television show, saying things like, wow, that's really cool. Look at that. Notice this. This reminds me of that, and so on. I've tried to restrain some of that in these notes, and mainly so the notes are either vocabulary, words that may not be familiar, or just cultural, historical context. For example, in The Rat Began to Gnaw the Rope, the product known as bluing is mentioned. I didn't know what bluing was, but I found out it was a laundry detergent product, uh, and so on. There are slang expressions. There are references to pop culture that were pop back then, not so pop today, to know who the players of the day were or the baseball players of the day and so on, that just, as anybody would, things that we drop into the regular conversation, and don't even think about that they are tied to a particular time and a particular place. So the idea of the notes is to help the reader appreciate those references.
I think the notes are just terrific. I think every mystery fan will just enjoy the notes on their own. My favorite is the detailed explanation of the title of The Rat, which I'm sure everybody thinks about. What the hell is a book doing being called The Rat
Yeah. Please tell us
Began to
about
Gnaw
that.
the Bone? So, House, why don't you might recite the whole poem if you'd like.
Oh, well, let's see. I'll tell you what, while you explain, I'll see if I can find the note.
Well, as it turns out, it's a nursery rhyme, a Mother Goose nursery rhyme that has multiple lines in a kind of a sequential way, beginning or almost at the beginning, the hat began to gnaw the bone, and then a whole bunch of series of things happened. And I was fascinated by the fact that the author, I almost said his name, but I didn't, had intended to write a series of multiple books, each taking its title from Honolulu Pines in the nursery rhyme. And he did write one other one. And I
Right.
would have loved to have seen the whole thing.
You know, it's a footnote. You know, Bill, I'm constrained to saying what I often do when somebody asks me something, which is, it's in the book somewhere. You know,
Okay.
the name of the second book was the Rope Began to Hang the Butcher, and he had a third book planned, the title of which was The Butcher Began to Kill the Ox, which unfortunately he never finished.
There's also, I think, fascinating author information in all of the books, in your endnotes and introductions. And I thought it was very melancholy that this author had discovered that crime novels didn't earn him much, decided to go on to making money, but had, when I turn 75, I think he said, or when I retire, something like that, I'm going to go back and write all these books. Well, of course, he didn't live that long. Yes. But, you know, sad note. Don't, authors out there, don't wait.
No, that's right. Don't wait. Get it out there. Fortunately, he did leave a legacy, not only of these two books. There's a third book that he wrote called Beyond a Reasonable Doubt, which is a standalone. It's not about Gil Henry, and it too was very well received. Well, I mean, I think what we tried to do, our aim with these books is, or let's say our ideal audience, is libraries and schools. These books, we've included in the books not only the wonderful introductions by the Librarian of Congress, a sort of contextual introduction by me, and I want to talk about context in a little bit, but the notes to help readers, suggested further reading about the author, and discussion group questions, because there are questions that come out of reading these books. Why does this happen? And what do you think about that? And so on. And so I hope that these books will end up being used in classrooms and certainly being used in libraries for book clubs and discussion groups.
Hey, you mentioned context. Tell us about context.
So these books span a long period of American history, and not all of those periods of history are ones that we should be proud of. And attitudes have changed about many things over time. I mean, that's no great insight. So, for example, in The Rat Began to Rope, Gil Henry, nobody can particularly fault him. He's a sort of very typical 1940s male. He has relationships with women that are sort of drawn from the 1940s. He doesn't, I won't say that he doesn't respect them. I don't think that comes across, but I think that, he says things to them that today we wouldn't find acceptable for somebody to say. Similarly, well, I mean, so a different example is the Anna Catherine Green That Affair Next Door, where it's set in Gilded Age New York. Anna Catherine Green was a very successful writer, and she doesn't know the lower classes particularly well. And so there are a few of the lower classes that show up in the book, mostly servants. There's a Chinese laundryman who comes across like a stereotypical Chinese laundryman. But that's the way it was. Those were the attitudes of the time, and they're not to be condoned, but they are to be reckoned with and dealt with. I often talk about how in my classic American crime fiction collection, one of the novels is The House Without a Door, which is the first Charlie Chan novel. And it's set in Hawaii, where there was a good deal of conflict and hostility among the white/Japanese and Chinese populations. The Chinese did not like the Japanese and vice versa. And there's a lot of words in the book that are not acceptable in polite conversations anymore. It's the way people talked back then. And we haven't tried to edit these books or to censor or Bowdlerize them in any way. We've tried to put them in context in the introductions. There's positive things too. For example, in Case Pending, the lead is Luis Mendoza, an Hispanic, actually of Spanish blood, very pointedly of Spanish blood, detective for the Los Angeles Police Department. Well, this isn't very long after the Zoot Suit riots. And so he still has to hear comments about his ethnic background. There are Mexican immigrants featured as part of the story. They're a very important part of the story. And his relationship with them and some sense of superiority that comes from him. All of those things are things that are important to understand and look back at as part of our history.
I think in Carla Hayden's forewords, she does a very good job of addressing these various issues about historical context and attitudes toward race, and, gender, and social concerns, and basically makes the same points as just made. But I think it's very good to get the books going on that code.
I'm very excited, for example, that in Last Seen Wearing. Last Seen Wearing is about a college girl who disappears. And the book is all about trying to figure out, did she just vanish? The first suspicion is and this is not giving anything away, we find this suspicion almost immediately in the book, that she's become pregnant and she's taken herself sort of out of society to go off and have an abortion. Well, this is, this is the time when the Kinsey report had just come out, and there was starting to be some open discussion about women's sexuality and abortion, and maybe some realizations that it wasn't just a dirty, dark secret that nobody wanted to talk about. But it's really interesting to me to look at the attitudes expressed in the book, and the attitudes that were in the culture at that time. So again, these books are mirrors, and we need to look at ourselves in these various mirrors and see what the American culture was like and how perhaps we've gotten better today, I hope, but we can't forget about our history.
Okay, I'm going to hop in here and give us time for our first Library of Congress Crime Classics Trivia Poll. And can I just say, Library of Congress Crime Classics is not easy to say. Remember, each time that you participate in one of the activities or ask a question in the Q&A, you're entered in to win a Library of Congress Crime Classics prize pack. The poll is on your screen below. So you can read that and have a look. Bill,
Yeah,
Les.
you can't play.
Okay.
It says so right to the bottom.
Bill, Les, tell us a little bit about some of the other authors that are in the series beyond this one.
Well, so another one that we haven't mentioned is the wonderful name of Rodriguez Ottolenghi. Say, that's a mouthful. So Ottolenghi wrote several books, and this particular one is called Final Proof. It came out in 1901. Ottolenghi was an Orthodox Jew who grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, and which turned out, to my surprise, to be a real center of Orthodox Jewry in America at that time. He moved to New York and set up a dental practice, and he wrote mysteries for a short period of time only, and then gave it up to go back to being a dentist. But he was a very well-known dentist. He was one of the original founders of the ADA, and was also the first author to suggest seriously that forensic dentistry could be an important tool in police work. The stories, it's a collection of short stories, and the short stories are about an amateur detective and a police detective working together. They're very clever. He clearly knew his Sherlock Holmes and loved the Sherlock Holmes stories and sort of wanted to do his own thing. So that's one. I just finished editing two others. The Silent Bullet, which is a collection of short stories. The first collection of Craig Kennedy scientific detective stories came out in 1911. Kennedy was known as the American Sherlock Holmes, and is one of those characters that is nobody's heard of him today, and he was immensely popular back then. The author, Arthur B. Reeve, was very, very successful. The stories went on to be comic strips, movies, a stage play, a long, long series of books. And today, hardly anybody knows who Craig Kennedy, scientific detective, was. And as I mentioned earlier, also The Dead Letter. The Dead Letter by a woman named Meta Victor, who wrote under the name Seeley Register. The Dead Letter is the first American mystery novel, published in 1866, and groundbreaking in so many ways. Not the first American novel, not the first novel by a woman, the first American mystery novel. And it was really due to Register that mystery fiction sort of got restarted in America. She was a prolific writer and an inspiration, I think, to Anna Catherine Green, who gets all the credit. She's the mother of crime fiction, but Register really was.
Okay, so we have, I think we can conclude the poll. The correct answer by a lot of folks here was Sue Grafton, and I'll pull in one of the questions actually, based on that. Is if you would comment on any continuity you see from father to daughter in style or substance of their mystery fiction, if any.
If any. Wow. Yeah. Bill?
Well, I think they're certainly playing on the hard-boiled uh, novel tradition, which Grafton was very much elaborating on. I think that Kinsey Malone is a bit of a wisecracker, as was her father's detective. But really, it's an evolution. Certainly, she profited, as you point out in your introduction, from being surrounded by her father's collection of detective novels, and that's where
Yes.
she got her start reading them. So there are connections. There aren't obvious ones, I don't think.
I think that's a fair assessment. So.
Okay, I want to take a question from one of our participating libraries. This one is from Rolling Hills Consolidated Library in Missouri, who writes, how do you think these classic detective crime novels are linked to modern television series like Law and Order or NCIS? What's the balance between formulaic stories and maintaining suspense or surprise in telling tales?
Well, I think in television, we've gone through cycles. I mean, we're now pretty much at the focused on the police procedural. Stories about regular people doing their jobs. It's not so much about the mystery. In the words of Joseph Wamba, paraphrased by Michael Connelly, it's about how the case works the cop, not the cop works the case. Yeah, we like to learn about forensic science and all that, but it's more about the detectives and their interaction, and they're ordinary people, their love affairs, their domestic problems, and so on. We haven't had much classic mystery on television or even in film for a while. We used to have shows like Murder, She Wrote, or Diagnosis Murder, or something where there was really a puzzle, and some clever interrogation or some smart thinking led to a solution that was probably a surprise. But we don't see much of that on television right now.
In fact, I think one of the reasons that the British Library series has been so successful, and I'm sure this one will too, is that I think that right now in the world of crime novels, and we're seeing great things from lots of different authors, but really the emphasis right now, I think, is mostly on thrillers, be they be high-end literary thrillers, psychological thrillers, domestic thrillers. Of course, cozies haven't gone away,
Right.
And you still have that.
And there's a puzzle element.
History plot puzzle element there, but I do think that traditional whodunit history never lost its audience. It just, the audience is finding a little harder to find those titles, and these books, one way or another, all fulfill that. I want a detective novel where there's a problem to solve and I can try to solve it too. Over the years, we started to focus more on character-driven thrillers more than on plot, which is fine too. But I do think there's a need amongst a lot of readers who aren't necessarily cozy fans. They don't want a blueberry muffin with their crime novel. And there's nothing wrong with that either, of course. But these books go back to that era where the traditional detective story could be hard-boiled, it could be police, it could be a little grisly, but it still had that whodunit angle. And I think that's driving a lot of this.
That's great, and I want to come back to that in the next question, because I see there's a question in the chat that I want to bring forward here. But I want to first bring forward our other trivia poll question for everyone. So I think it'll come up on the screen now-ish, and there we go. So folks, there is your second poll question, and
And this one
gentlemen,
I told you the answer to.
you
So
did. So were you listening? Um, so, gentlemen, if you could tell me a little bit about one of the next books in the series. So we have an October 6th release date for Final Proof.
okay, well, so Final Proof is interesting. The detectives there are really an interesting pair. There's a smart and there's a police detective who is not Inspector Lestrade. Let me put it that way. He is smart and capable, and nonetheless, he's always a little bit one step behind his friend, who is an amateur detective. But the stories are clever problems, and very well done, and quite enjoyable. There's also a novel, but this is the collection of short stories. The book is incredibly rare, and to find I'm not holding up a first edition for anybody to see because I don't have it, but it's a treat to read.
I just want to say about the books in this series, that there's a lot of historical context. There's a lot of context within the genre, and it's really fascinating to have those layers put on top of what are some ripping good reads. I mean, these are really wonderful reads, and I think that has to be noted.
Somebody asked how we pick the titles. I saw,
Yes.
and I wanted to try and explain that because it's a mystical process. So it starts with generally me, or perhaps in one case Barbara Peters, tossing out the names of some of our favorite books. And I must say, I have mined the lists of bests that have been published by many different critics over the years, where, it's not just me thinking this is a good book. Lots of other people have said, this is really a great book. And we sort of put them on the table. And obviously, one of the things we look to see first is the book just ordinarily, is it already out there? Is it available readily, and has been competently covered? And the answer pleasantly for example, the Leavenworth case. We're not doing the Leavenworth case. There are 37 editions of the Leavenworth case, and it's been well covered. But then it goes to the Library of Congress folks, and they've actually set up a reading committee internally who reads the books that we nominate and says, we think that's really boring, or, we really like that one. And then we sort of circle back and talk about it and pick a title. We are, at the moment, I think we have agreed on the first, I think we're up to 8. And someone asked how long the series will go on, and the answer is as long as you'll buy them.
Okay, so let's close our poll here, where the correct answer was Agatha Christie.
Yes, Christie knew who had come before her. She admired Anna Catherine Green's work very much. As by the way, as did Mary Roberts Reinhardt, who also knew this work, knew Green's work, and was inspired by it. And Christie's Miss Marple is very similar in many ways to Amelia Butterworth. She's a little less jokey. I mean, that is to say, Marple is jokier, a little funnier than Amelia Butterworth, who took herself pretty seriously. And another difference is that all of the Amelia Butterworth cases involve Inspector Ebenezer Grice, whereas I don't recall a consistent police officer in the Marple cases.
I think there's maybe an interesting difference too, though, in that, I mean, obviously there's a strong link between the two, but whereas Miss Marple, sharp as she is, projects a very self-effacing front of, oh, I wouldn't know as much as you, Mr. Policeman, do, but maybe, and then she tells the policeman what he ought to be doing. Whereas Amelia is much more out front.
Yeah.
I mean, she pretty much says, I know as much about this as you, and I want to compete with you. She
Absolutely
says,
right.
I want to solve this case before you do.
Absolutely right. It really becomes a competition between her and Grice.
Yeah, and I think that almost goes, even though she was late 19th century, it kind of jumps right by the classic female detectives of the Golden Age, and almost in a way reminds you of Sarah Petsky or Marcia Muller, some of the modern 20th century people who had female detectives who were no nonsense and not ready to be self-effacing for anybody. So I think that's an extremely interesting part of this character, because she talks in a very antique way, sounds like Miss Marple, but sometimes what comes out of her mouth isn't Miss Marple-like at all, which I think is great fun.
I think Anna Catherine Green is a really terrific writer who just doesn't get enough attention anymore. She described what she was writing as crime romances, which makes them sound sort of like cozies in a way. But she could be very tough-minded and not very romantic. Leavenworth Case is a great book if you haven't read it. Another one of my favorites is a collection of hers called the 13 Problems for Violet Strange. Violet is a debutante who discovers that she has a knack for detecting and decides to hire herself out as a detective to earn enough money. The family has become impoverished after her coming out. She wants to get her sister out there. She wants to raise enough money for that, and that's it. When she's got the money, she's done. This is, again, I think, became very much like the Tommy and Tuppence books that Agatha Christie wrote later.
Yes, I like those a lot. I think people don't know those as well as they ought to. They're just delightful.
So a question that's popped up here is about the first American mystery by a woman author. Let me be really clear what I said about The Dead Letter. I didn't say it's the first American mystery by a woman. I said it's the first American mystery novel, period. Edgar Allan Poe may have written 3 short stories, but then he got bored and moved on to other things and sort of never went back to the mystery genre again. And there certainly are books in the interim. They're not novels. There's a lot of books in the middle between Poe and Green that are what are known now as case books. These are typically supposed to be memoirs or recollections of law clerks, judges, police officials, private detectives, etc. Many of them may have had some basis in fact, but are largely fiction. How can you tell? Well, let's see, when the same author is putting out things like Confessions of a New York Detective, and then the next one is Confessions of a Detective from some other place, he probably wasn't both. So, but those were very popular for a long time, but they're not novels. They are sort of collections of unconnected cases, and that's why they're known as case books.
So if anyone still has other questions, to please put them into the Q&A. We've kind of ambled our way into the Q&A in a very natural kind of way. We're already in the middle of it. So if you have additional ones, please put them in. But I want to bring forward and come back around to what we were talking about a little bit before. The question here from Donna, who asks, can you comment on the evolution of the mystery genre? That most mysteries today are mashups which include other genres, domestic suspense, thrillers, cozies, etc. How do you see the mystery genre evolving in the future?
Well, I want to say something, and then I want to hear what Bill has to say. One of the things I wanted to say is back when Anna Catherine Green, Celie Register, Louisa May Alcott, Harriet Spofford, so many of the great 19th century women writers were writing, there was no such thing as genre. They wanted to write stories. And this story might be a mystery today. Again, we put a label on it. This is a mystery. This is a horror story. This is a romantic story. This is a fairy tale fantasy. They didn't have that. They were writing for magazines and they wrote whatever they felt like. And that's why I've included some of the same authors in my collections of horror fiction, ghost stories, mystery fiction, etc.
Well, I certainly think Donna is right on the mark about the genre blending that's going on today, and I'm sure will continue to go on in all kinds of forms. But I agree with Les. I can see from the librarian's point of view, certainly, not arguing with this, the value of labels when you're doing reader's advisor. The value of saying this is mystery, this is a domestic thriller, and so on. But my own view, and the one that I used for years in organizing book list, was crime fiction. If crime is central to the plot, it's a crime novel. And really, that's all you need to know. It's as wide a net as you can have. And certainly, as I think Les talks about somewhere on in the introductions, Dickens, Poe, obviously wrote crime novels or wrote novels that were, and certainly Dostoevsky. I've argued somewhere that Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure was the first noir novel. I mean, it doesn't get more noir than kids hanging themselves because there's too many kids and not enough food for the family. So I think that sometimes it can be limiting to categorize varieties of crime. Sometimes you need to think this is a crime. But as I said earlier, I certainly do think that if there's any sort of shortage today, I feel that even though I'm a fan of the hard-boiled noir side, so I'm happy with the way books are coming out now, thrillers and noir novels. But I do think that the genre today isn't serving the classic detective story fan quite as well as it once did. But I would guess that this is a cyclical thing, like almost everything is. There was a time when that was the dominant kind of crime novel. Now it's shrunk a bit. Stories like this bring it back on everybody's mind.
And these labels, I think, can be a real burden for the authors too.
Yes.
Where the author who has a successful book in one niche, we'll call it a niche because it's not the genre, it's sort of a sub-genre, and wants to write something a little different, the publishers, and unfortunately many readers are saying, no, we want another book that's just like your last one, except different.
Yeah, that's always an issue.
I can speak from the publisher's point of view that is always a challenge. It always comes back to the consumers, and yes, oftentimes they would really like the same book in a different kind of way, and it's difficult. It's unfortunate and challenging, I think, for authors. So, gentlemen. We want to get behind the scenes a little bit here because both of you have these wonderful backgrounds. Folks want to know how your books are organized behind you. We could it's almost like you're both in front of a Zoom background that you just loaded in, but no, those are actually your shelves.
Well, S has more on view. I have more of a close-up view, but I can just quickly say that they're vaguely subject-oriented. That is, over on that side, you have biography and criticism and essays and that kind of thing. Starting on this side, you have British novels and stories. those brown books there are all Dickens in a set, a very old set given to me by my godmother. And I'll only say one more thing about it. This shelf here and most of this shelf down below are devoted to probably my favorite writer, the English novelist Anthony Pohl, who wrote a 12 novel sequence called Dance to the Music of Time that is kind of old fashioned by today's standards, but I just love. And I buy every edition. I've got 6, 7 editions of the same book. So there's a lot of that.
My collection, this is only a tiny part of it. I have probably 7,000 or 8,000 books in the house here. My wife complains about this constantly. Unfortunately, many of them are in cartons because I've run out of shelf space in this. This is my office. There's a guest room that's full of books. There's shelves in the hall, etc. This whole section over here is Sherlock Holmes, sort of critical analytical works. Behind me, there are some Sherlock Holmes pastiches and parodies, and I stopped collecting those a while ago, except for old ones. I love to collect Sherlockian parodies and pastiches from the early parts of the 20th century. And then on this side is more research books, and there's books about the mystery genre here. And then in the guest room is where all the vampire and Frankenstein and supernatural related books are, just to scare the heck out of anybody sleeping there.
Okay, so we're getting close to the end here. We have we should have some winners from those who are participated in tonight's event. We thank everyone for doing that, and I think we're going to be listing winners in the chat. Winners in the chat, if you're a winner, please email Tiffany Schultz for your prize. That is Tiffany, Tiffany.Schultz, SCHULTZ @sourcebooks.com. And congratulations to those of you, and we appreciate everyone joining in tonight. Les and Bill, fascinating to be able to chat with you tonight, and a big thank you to everyone for joining us at Murder in the Library this evening. Want to make a note that we have another event next month on Wednesday, September 30th at 7 o'clock Eastern Time, 6 o'clock Central, for our next book club event, and that'll be with New York Times bestselling author Jane Stanton Hitchcock and her award-winning mystery Bluff, which I have back here. So Jane will be in conversation with my dear friend, the illustrious Barbara Peters, who makes another appearance this evening of the Poison Pen Bookstore. She'll serve as the evening's moderator, and a link for registration for that. If you want to get registered for that right now and get it on your calendar, please do that. That's in the chat as well. So Les, Bill, and everyone for joining us, thank you. We wish you happy reading. Stay safe, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. It was fun.